All right, we will go ahead and proceed with the hearing on truth and taxation. Paul Durbin.
All right, good evening. Chair Nelson, School Board, Superintendent Wagner, community, welcome to this year's Truth and Taxation hearing for 24 pay 25 levy. So the requirements for a Truth and Taxation meeting are twofold. One, discuss the district budget and the 24 pay 25 property tax levy. And two, an opportunity for public comment and questions, which we'll have before our regular scheduled board meeting after the hearing. So on the screen in front of you is a timeline, part in summary, but also showing where we're headed with the levy. It begins in the summer when we submit data to the Department of Education for the preliminary levy calculations. And on September 30th, the preliminary levy was approved by you, the board, at the maximum. And then this evening, December 2nd, we have our Truth and Taxation hearing, and the school board will certify our levy, our final levy, at a specific dollar amount. Two important pieces then, and we'll look at this through a different lens a little bit later in the presentation, but our property taxes that are collected will be starting in January of this year over 2025, and that's revenue that's generated for the 25-26 school year. So the first requirement of the Truth and Taxation hearing is to discuss district budget. So we'll go through some high-level concepts and talk about what the budget looks like. Later this year in March, we will go through and approve a revised budget for this fiscal year. For now, we will start with our adopted fiscal year 25 budget. We have 5 main funds that we account revenue and expenditures for as a school district. As we discussed the levy this evening, 3 of these funds carry a tax levy component. So the general fund, community service fund, and debt service fund are all funded in part by our levy. This slide here shows the revenue that's budgeted for the district. So as you can see, again, this is our adopted budget for this year, and we will look at revisions in March. So you may have seen these percentages in an earlier presentation, either from Executive Director Walsh or myself. But a majority of our revenue is generated through state aid, 81% this year, which equates for about $47 million is generated through state aid. Also note that if you followed our budget in the past few years, the federal aids is lower, and that's due to COVID funds coming off, right? Or those COVID relief funds that maybe we received in past years. And it's also interesting that the levy is only about 12% of our district's budget, of our revenue, far less that you would see through maybe the city or county, where a lot more of their budgets are generated through a levy. This slide here is just for simple purposes of showing that our other funds may have a different component or it may be funded differently. So for example, food service is funded mostly through federal aids, where community service, and I see us must have been cut off, community service is generated mostly local revenues, and it's supposed to say and levy for that 74% there. So if you want to make that revision on this slide. As we look at graphs, I apologize, board members and Superintendent Wagner. I did put a handout that has the graphs, and so if there's anything that's challenging to see on the screen this evening, you should have a packet there to find these representations in front of you as well. So as we continue to look at our budget, now moving to expenditures, how do we use the revenue that we're generating? This chart illustrates one way that we can look at this, and what's important to note is that salaries and benefits are almost 80% of all of our spending. And as a service organization, that's what you want to see, that the funds are going towards your staff and your people, the salaries and benefits for your staff. All right, because enrollment has a significant impact on our levy, We want to touch on this evening, but we don't want to get stuck in the weeds, as we'll be back in February with a more in-depth presentation about enrollment for our district. So we'll have a study session in February where we'll go into more depth. Enrollment is very challenging to predict, so as we talk about actuals and estimates, please remember that as we talk about future years, we are talking about just that. They are estimates to our best ability. And we have some pretty solid projections that we use to come up with those estimates, but they are just that, an estimate. So let's focus on the three definitions that are below the numbers, and then we can take a look at those three numbers on the screen. So October 1 enrollment count is one measure that we use to measure enrollment. This is used by the Minnesota Department of Education, MDE, in calculation for federal revenue and federal E-rate, and it's also used in a few other formulas for school funding. This official enrollment count is generated through our MARS reporting, which is Minnesota Automated Reporting Student Systems, our MARS files that we report centrally from the district to MDE. What's important about October 1 enrollment is that it ensures that students aren't counted in multiple districts. So if a family moves from one school district or one school to another, the student is only being accounted for in one specific school. We won't see the official October 1 enrollment number returned back to us until January, and that's the reason that we're going to come back in February for a more in-depth enrollment session at that point. The other two definitions here have more of an impact on the levy. ADM means average daily membership. This represents a portion of a school year which a student is enrolled. So it's simply the number of days the student is enrolled in our district divided by the board-approved number of student contact days. So, for example, let's just use a number. Let's say, I know is it 173? Let's say it's 170 for a nice round number is our board-approved number of days. If a student's here 153 days, that would be 90%. That 0.9 would be our ADM for that student if they were only enrolled for, say, the 153 out of the 170 days. So every student will be assigned an ADM for our district, and the sum of those will equal our district's ADM. And the APU is just an adjusted weighted ADM, and it's the primary count used in school funding formulas. And the other interesting piece for an APU, so it might look a little bit higher than our actual enrollment or number of students and seats. The APU has a multiplier for students that are in grades 7 through 12 of a 1.2. So now as we look at those numbers at the top of your screen here, if we look at our actuals for 22-23, our ADM was 3,370.75, so you notice the decimal there. That's due to the calculation that we use to figure out an ADM. 23-24, our ADM was slightly less, 3,266.54. And our estimate for this year using our projection models, what we used to build our budget, was 3,199.8. So we see a slight decline in enrollment there. So a lot with those definitions, but it's important to understand what we're using to come up with the numbers that we'll see when we talk about the levy here shortly. So when we see property tax base grow in value and our enrollment decline, we end up with a larger tax base per pupil. So one phrase that you may hear out in other publications is property wealth or property wealthy school districts. And when we see a property values increase and our enrollment decrease, we are going to see a greater ratio of property wealth to per pupil or pupil units. And what this has an impact on is something called equalization. And this is what the state uses to determine a mix of levy and aid. And so as we see our enrollment fluctuate in recent years decline, and we might see our property values increasing that we've seen in recent years, what we're gonna see is more reliance on levy versus aid. But also keep in mind, there's another variable that as enrollment declines, we also might see our total revenue decline as well. So it doesn't always necessarily mean more taxes when that happens. It's a very dynamic formula, right? So this chart here is very helpful to see what's happening with enrollment here in Albert Lea. So here's a historical representation of the last 10 years of our ADM in our district. We'll be back in February to go more in depth on enrollment, but it will help us today to just see what's happening with our levy as we dig into this presentation. So looking forward to our revised budget. Early indications are showing that our enrollment projections are going to come out really close to what we set for our adopted budget. So remember that 3,199 ADM that we mentioned in a prior slide. Projections are looking good. We'll know more after the October 1st number comes back, and we can dig into that enrollment discussion with the board in February. And that will guide us in our revised budget work that will come back in March. So at this point, there's no other significant changes. So as we lean into that revised budget later this year, it's mostly depending on where our enrollment comes out. The second part of the requirements for a truth and taxation hearing is to discuss the levy. So our 24 pay 25, a reminder, is to certify the levy in December of 24. Those property taxes will be collected through fiscal year 25, and that revenue is for the 25-26 school year. And what's really unique about this chart that's in front of you now is you can see that the school district's revenue that we're generating starting in January of 25 isn't used until the 25-26 school year, which begins in July. So we're collecting taxes starting this next month that are really for the next school year. So we're offset a little bit, whereas our other municipalities, the city, county, and other municipalities are collecting taxes for a budget that is beginning the same year that they're collecting them. The other portion to note there about other municipalities and how they collect their taxes is they have a little bit more leeway in deciding how much to levy for. Where a district, if we want to go out beyond the maximum, which we've approved in our preliminary levy, we would need to go out for an operating referendum and ask for voter approval on that. In this case, this year, we did not need to do that, and we just stuck with the maximum, which we're entitled to. All right, so again, the three main funds that we generate funds through the levy for our general fund, our community service fund, and our debt service fund. And each of these may have some of their levy generated over different tax categories. And we'll talk about those two tax categories this evening. There's a referendum market value tax category, and there's a net tax capacity category. Because we did not ask for an operating referendum or go out for any additional voter approved bonds, you won't see any changes from some of the numbers in the presentation tonight. So I apologize. There will be some repeat information from what you saw back in September to this evening. So the levy as it is proposed, the general fund portion will decrease by $651,572. That's a decrease from last year's 23 pay 24 levy to this year's 24 pay 25 levy. Some highlights here to explain this decrease. If you remember, there was a large positive adjustment on last year's levy. And with the absence of that this year, it looks like a reduction in the levy. But really, the levy was just being adjusted last year for maybe enrollment change from a prior year. So that referendum adjustment was there last year. It's not there this year, so it looks like a decrease of about $223,000 from last year's levy. The other reason that we see some decrease in this general fund levy is that declining in enrollment. It's a much smaller impact on that decrease in our levy, but it's part of the reason that that levy is declining. And then the one that's very clear to see, and we can connect the dots to, is we approved the sale of bonds for our mechanical projects in our LTFM funds. So we're gonna see a decrease in the levy for the general fund for LTFM funding, so long-term facility maintenance decrease of $362,130. And most of that is simply gonna shift to a levy in our debt service. So essentially a wash. So I talked about the two tax categories that contribute to the levy. The first of those categories is your referendum market value. Really, this just adds up all properties of value and divides them in a prorated manner. Essentially, a homeowner and a business are taxed the same percentage in a RMV, your referendum market value. The referendum market value does not include seasonal recreational cabins or seasonal rec and ag land. Those are excluded from these taxes. One thing that's important to note here is that this year, the referendum market value, this tax category in our district, is about $1.9 billion, 1.97, compared to 1.9 billion last year, an increase of 3.9%. And the point that I want to make with this slide is that our property values are increasing. But if you think back a couple of years, the RMV in our district increased over 20% 2 years ago, and I believe it was 7.9% last year. So our property values are increasing, yes, but at a slower rate than they were in the past. So it's important to note that we still are seeing a property value increase, and specifically with this category of the RMV. So this slide here shows what types of what is being funded through the referendum market value levy on the general fund. So we have our local optional revenue, our voter approved operating levy, our equity revenue, and transition revenue. And you see that this levy for the general fund in this tax category, the referendum market value, is about $4,148,413. Okay, this next slide shows the other main form of property tax category, which is our net tax capacity. And these levies are when each property type is multiplied by a class rate specific to their property type and their value. So the increase last year was 7.8%. In the year prior, 21.7%. And we're seeing an increase in our net tax capacity in our district of 2% this year. So again, we're seeing that same trend. Property values have been going up over the last couple of years, but at a much smaller rate this year, 2% compared to that 20% increase in that 7.8% last year. So a slower rate than in the past. So looking at our general fund, these are the types of things that are funded through the net tax capacity in our general fund. So we have our operating capital, our teacher performance pay, our QComp, our achievement integration, unemployment insurance, safe schools, career and tech ed, long-term facility maintenance, and leases. And just a side note, that LTFM, normally about 1.3 million, we see that this is part of the reason for that reduction this year in our general fund and the levy. So the general fund levies distributed on net tax capacity are $2,250,518. Community education saw a minor increase in the levy from last year. A lot of that had to do with our early childhood family education. It's a very minor increase from year to year, so not a lot of discussion on this. But our levy on community education comes out to $167,989. That includes our basic community ed fund, ECFE, early childhood family education, and our home visits. One thing to note here, this is levied, and I noticed I didn't write it in here, but this is levy distributed over net tax capacity, not over the RMV. So that second category. And then our debt service, also levied over the net tax capacity. We're going to see an increase of $401,170. Most of that is due to the bonds that we sold for our LTFM. So that's shifting from our general fund over to our debt service. And this includes the fiscal year 26 principal and interest payments plus 5% for any of our debt. And it includes bond payments for that LTFM project, our boilers and HVAC units that which those projects are going well, by the way. So the debt service fund over net tax capacity, $3,230,534. Now we'll have a few new slides this evening that maybe we haven't seen before. So these are, this is information that I found interesting based off of our tax base. This graph comes to us from one of our financial advisors, PMA. I apologize if it's hard to see, so please reference the packet in front of you if you can't see the subtitles there or the notes. But if you look at this graph, what it shows is the per pupil funding and what it may have been if it had followed inflation, the CPI, since 2003. And what we're seeing is a significant gap between that, what our actual formula allowance is and our basic formula. Now, this whole concept isn't about the levy, this is about state aid. But what it does demonstrate is that there is a shortfall between, if we had followed inflation with our state formula, our funding for state aid, there's a significant gap of where we actually are. And it is challenging to fund schools without, when our revenues aren't keeping pace with inflation. So it's a bit dramatic, but this year alone, should that formula have followed the CPI instead of waiting for legislation to force more funding from year to year at different rates, we would have seen $4,718,000 more this year alone in state aid than what we are seeing. So we see a large gap because that we did not follow that inflationary factor. Just note also that this actual formula allowance has been changing year to year due to legislation and state and changes with the model. I think we saw an increase last year from 6,863 per pupil to 7,281. All right, now a few slides that I think our residents in our community would really appreciate. School property tax history on a $100,000 residential home. This is a $100,000 home in 2018 to a $100,000 home in 2019, all the way to 2025. This is for comparing apples to apples year to year. It's not necessarily realistic for a home value that was in 2018 to 2025. That home will probably be valued at a much greater rate now, and we'll look at some other comparisons for that. What this does, though, is shows us what our tax history as a district is on a $100,000 home in our community. And you see that it's significantly less in 2025 than it was in prior years. Without a graph, because there's so many different categories of properties, here's, I think, a helpful tool. We can look at residential homestead. These are the impacts of our school taxes on different types of properties. And so what you see on the left is the estimated market value of these types of properties. And if the property doesn't increase in value from last year to this year, the school district tax impact would go down. And if you look at residential homes, it's somewhere between 7 and 12%. Again, this is all based on those property valuations and the value of the property. So with that said, looking at the average residential home in our school district, 2015 was right around 100,000. Now the average home in our area is about 175,000. So times are changing. We saw a significant jump between 22 and 23. And as you know, when we talked about our RMV and net tax capacity, we talked about 2 years ago about a 20% increase in that RMV and net tax capacity and about an 8% last year. We're seeing that here in the average home values in our community as well. Also keep in mind, every individual home and property, the values change differently year to year. And so one person and their neighbor's property values may be increasing at different rates or decreasing at different rates and assessed at different values. So it's hard to kind of pinpoint and give an exact depiction of what will happen, but we can get a pretty good idea of just a general sense of what's happening in our community. All right, so this next slide, so we saw the slide noting that there's a decrease in tax on residential homes if the price stayed the same or their value of their home stayed the same from one year to the next. So this slide also from PMA, they've generated an estimated property value increase of 4%, which is the estimate for our area this year, that property valuations will go up 4%. And we'll get a better number next year once we see where those all come out. But what you could see is, say, a $144,000 home last year may be valued at $150,000 this year after that 4% increase. And what they'll actually realize in the school district contribution of their taxes would be a decrease in 5.9% of their tax, the school district portion of their tax. So we see a little bit of relief in the school district portion, even with a property value increase on these residential homestead properties here. All right, and this slide is the one that made me decide I should print off some graphs for you in your packet, because it's really hard to see that table down below. But essentially, it's taking that same home value that was outlined in an earlier slide and looking at year to year, similar to what we had on that $100,000 home. What's happening now if we take that 2018, we had a $104,000 home, $104,800, and following the trends in our community, it would be about a $150,000 home this year. And what we see is that, you know, over the years, their school district contribution to their property tax kind of has gone up slightly, and then this year diving down a little bit, down to 547 there. This just lets us take a little deeper look at historical values with those school district impact and what's happening with the property tax increase. All right, these next two slides are kind of fun. A very, I would say, primitive way to demonstrate distribution of taxes with the idea of property valuation changes. Here on this slide, what you see is a tax base that includes two homes. So if we pretend there's only two homes in our community and we had a levy of $100 as a school district and both homes were equal value, they'd each pay the same amount. In this scenario, $50 each for the slide on, or the graphic on the left. If they both went up the same value from year to year and our levy didn't change, there would be no change in tax burden between the two homes. They'd still both pay $50 share of that levy. However, if we update this slide and we look at the same small district, two homes, one of them only goes up 10% in value, but another home goes up 40%, you see that the home that went up more will take on more of that tax burden, right? And the actual impacts of that is the home that went up less is gonna have less of a tax burden. So it gets really complicated when you mix in your commercial industrial, your ag land, the number of different types of properties in your community and all the homes that you have. And as those valuations change, one neighbor scenario might be different than their next door neighbor or somebody down the street, right? Or someone else in the community. So as property values change, the shift in burden changes too. And so that explains a lot of what's happening on each individual tax statement. It often has a lot more to do with their property valuations than it does with the levy that we have in front of us. All right, one other point that we want to bring in here to the conversation is that on our debt service levy, there's an Ag to School bond credit that the state of Minnesota has, which has reached its maximum in 2023. And it will continue that maximum rate of 70% tax credit. Our debt service levy was about $3.2 million this year. And essentially what this means is that the state is picking up the bill for about 70% of that levy. And our ag land is, or the farmer would pay that 30% portion. That equates to about $586,000 that our local farmers would be on the hook for should this tax credit not be in place. They don't need to do anything. They don't need to apply for this. It automatically comes off of their tax statement every year. And so it's just something nice to point out that our farmers are receiving a little relief with this Ag to School bond credit. And then those payments do come back to us in the form similar to aid. But basically they calc out the amount that the state's portion is and the state will send us that contribution. All right, and this is an addition this year. I did receive 2 phone calls this year, and both calls were more about understanding what this statement means than anything else, and to talk about their property valuations, not so much about our levy. So this is an example. This is not a copy of an Albert Lea district. You notice that it says Spruce County, right? And Spruceville School District. This is a total imaginary, just an example, more of a learning device for us to look at our tax statements. So the third municipality listed on these is typically your school district levy. And so that's where the first thing that my eyes draw right to is where's our levy for the school district? Find that. And what you'll see is 2 components, a voter approved levy and a other levies listed. And this is sometimes, if you don't know or haven't been following school finance, which most people don't, this is where you kind of wonder what are we levying for? So voter-approved levies are taxes collected, for example, like operating referendums. I believe we renewed ours last in 2021. Maybe our building bonds that we sold to build our stadium. Those have a yearly levy component that we will see until those mature. So those would be like your voter-approved levies, and your other levies would be things, for example, local optional revenues, your operating capital, your LTFM that we mentioned this evening. Those would be different buckets that fall under that other levies. And if anybody ever has questions about their tax statements or what those levies might look like for our district, I would be happy to have a conversation and do a deep dive into those tax statements for them. Beyond this explanation tonight, it can get quite confusing as we went through with our finance committee this afternoon. But what taxpayers really want to do is when they're looking at this statement and they want to see what the school district's impact on their taxes is add up the two numbers here in the left column for the actual 24, add up the two numbers in the right column for fiscal year for proposed 25, and that will be the school district portions. And they can kind of compare what's happening from 24 to 25 from the school district portion of their property tax. And just to hammer home the point, a lot of times the biggest driver of what's happening with their taxes is truly their property valuation and not necessarily the levy. And the property valuation is up at the top right corner of this statement. So you can see what's happening with the values of your property as well. One last point with this before we kind of have some closing notes is that in the spring, you'll also get an estimate from the county about taxes, and that is the appropriate time if you think those property valuations are incorrect or you feel like there's a need to appeal. That would be there would be some instructions on the spring mailer that you get from the county on where to go to do so. All right, so this evening we've recapped everything from the timeline to our budgets, to how enrollment's impacting our levies, how levies are impacting our residents, full circle all the way back to the flyers or the mailers that we receive from the county in the mail. So I want to make a couple main points as we wrap this up today. A reminder that our two biggest factors on this year's levy are the absence of a large adjustment that we had last year that's no longer there this year, and our declining enrollment. So as our enrollment continues to decline, we're going to potentially have some tough decisions moving forward. Right now, we're very thankful we're in a good place. We met our fund balance goal this year. The district's in a strong financial position. So today, you can see the recommendations here. Just going through the summary on the chart. The general fund levy decreasing from last year, $651,573. Community ed levy increasing slightly, $5,497. And the debt service levy increasing about $401,169. So the total levy will decrease $244,907.48. That's a decrease from 23 pay 24 to 24 pay 25, or a decrease of 2.44%. So I do ask at the regular meeting portion of this evening that the board approves the 24 pay 25 levy at the specific dollar amount of $9,797,453. This now concludes the truth and taxation portion of tonight's meeting.
Thank you, Paul, for your presentation. We'll go ahead and move into our study session. I call the meeting to order. Join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Our next item is to approve today's agenda. It is an action item. Is there a second?
Second.
Motioned and second. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Motion carries. 4.1, approval of 2024 pay 2025 final levy. It is an action item.
So moved.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
It has been motioned and seconded. Any discussion? Paul is here to answer any questions.
There's nothing I like better than a taxation hearing in a 90-degree room, so thanks for whoever's responsible for that. The only thing I want to say is that, Paul, it's nice to see that you've put your spin on this, and I appreciate the additional information. You've given us more data to digest, and I think it helps keep us informed as board members. That's the only comment I had.
Any other comments, questions?
And also just the comment too, that a lot of times we don't understand with this kind of a levy, it is basically set by the state. You know, it's something, as we've talked about before, there's little spins here and there that you can do, but that's why when you have to start out by going with a maximum, then you get the real number when it comes down to it. So as we see this year, it comes out less, which is kind of nice. It'd be nice to be able to even those out and just do 2% a year, but that don't work that way. Instead of having to do like the city 15 or whatever, and it just don't work that way. Now, they're different, obviously, than what we are, but no, thanks for the explanations, Paul.
Any other questions, comments? All right. We will go ahead with the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries 7-0. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Before we move into adjournment, I'll share our mission to ensure individual academic, social, and emotional growth that leads to engaged citizens and lifelong learners. Our next meeting is Monday, December 16th. It is a regular school board meeting here in this room. I want to take a moment, though, because I won't be present at that meeting. And so Gary, I will be virtually, but I won't be leading. And I wanted to thank Bruce for your service. It has been a pleasure to be on the board with you. I've enjoyed it very much, and you've added a lot of spunk and content to our meetings. So thank you so much.
Still have one more.
You have one more, but I just want to take that time, because you never know about virtual if I get cut off or can't see or whatever, so.
The agenda I received said 6:30.
Oh, shoot. Well, you were here 2 minutes after we started. Yeah, thank you. All right, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Motion and second, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Motion carries, meeting adjourned.